Born in Italy in 1875, Eugenia Falleni was the oldest of 22 children, of which 17 would live past childhood. Her mother was married at 14 and gave birth to her at 16, and the family migrated to New Zealand around 1877 when Eugenia was around 2 or 3 years old. Growing up, Eugenia didn't act like the other girls. She cut her hair very short, she wore boys' clothes, she preferred the games that her brothers played, and she learned to ride horses extremely well. And as a teenager, she worked in brickyards and stables. At 19, her father attempted to marry her off, but it failed because the man was already married, and this caused her to leave home for good, and she got a job at sea. At 21, she worked on a ship, and an Italian seaman named Martello discovered that she was a woman through their frequent conversations because they both spoke Italian. She would say things here and there that eventually gave her secret away. She soon became pregnant by him, probably through assault, and she was either kicked off the ship in Newcastle, Australia, or she left voluntarily. She gave birth to a daughter named Josephine that she didn't want and couldn't afford, so she tried to smother her, but she didn't succeed. Eugenia believed that a widower with a child would be accepted a lot more than an unmarried mother, so she became a Scottish man named Harry Leo Crawford. Harry eventually met an Italian couple that were prepared to take in Josephine and take care of her. But the husband later became jealous of the attention that his wife was showing Josephine, so they left Australia and returned to Italy, where his wife and Josephine, who was now 12, worked domestic jobs. Young ladies were very interested in Harry Crawford, aka Eugenia, but he ignored their advances. He had his eye on his boss's housekeeper, a widowed mother named Annie Burkitt. Annie owned a small confectionery shop. To Annie, Harry was a handsome man who paid her a lot of attention and who wooed her with flowers and trips to the circus and the theater. But unfortunately, Harry lied to Annie from the very beginning. He said his name was Harry Crawford, and it wasn't. He said he was from Scotland when he was actually from Italy. He told Annie that he didn't have any relatives, despite the fact that he had a teenage daughter, 2 parents that were still alive, and around 16 or 17 siblings. He also told Annie that he had stopped drinking when he hadn't. But all of those lies paled in comparison to one of the worst lies that you could ever tell to someone that you're in love with. The man that had proposed to Annie in 1913 was actually a woman. Annie had a son that was also named Harry, and I'll refer to him as Young Harry to avoid any confusion. Young Harry didn't approve of their relationship, but he was too young to have any influence on it. And soon after they were married, they all moved to Drummoyne, Australia. In 1917, a neighbor told Annie that Harry was a woman, so she confronted Eugenia about it. She refused to answer because she was worried that Annie would tell the police and she would be arrested. You're probably wondering why Annie couldn't tell that she was married to a woman. Well, Eugenia did look very masculine. And during sex, she would use a dildo, and she always wore a loose-fitting undershirt, and I'm assuming that Annie never saw Eugenia naked. Soon, Annie understandably wanted a divorce, but Eugenia had hopes that the marriage would survive. And neighbors reported that the couple fought frequently, especially once Eugenia's daughter Josephine came to live with them after her adoptive mother passed away. It was somewhere around this time that Josephine discovered that the person she called father was actually her mother. She kept the secret, but it caused her to act out in anger and frustration, and young Harry had also become hostile, and Annie herself was having a hard time with Eugenia's drinking and the violence that came with it. It also caused her to sell her shop so that she and her son could move in with her sister. But eventually, Eugenia was able to persuade Annie to return, and she promised to do better. Sometime around late September, early October of 1917, Annie suggested that they go for a picnic near Lane Cove River. According to a statement that Eugenia later gave to the police, the two of them got into an argument during the picnic after Annie told her that she couldn't continue the marriage knowing that her husband wasn't really a man. She said that at some point during the argument, Annie slipped and fell backwards, hitting her head on a rock and losing consciousness. She didn't die immediately, but because she was unconscious, Eugenia assumed that she was already dead. So she panicked and started a fire, and she threw Annie's body on top of it. She kept building up that fire until the only thing that was left of Annie were ashes and bones. Young Harry was away at this particular time, but once he returned home and asked where his mother was, Eugenia told him that she had cleared out with a plumber. And shortly after, Eugenia sold the family's belongings and their furniture, and she moved away with young Harry. 2 years later, Eugenia, aka Harry Crawford, met Elizabeth King Allison, known as Lizzie, and they fell in love and were married in September of 1919. And Eugenia told her the same lies that she had told Annie. But somehow, though, Lizzie had convinced herself that she had gotten pregnant by Eugenia. She said that Harry was an ideal husband and they had a very happy married life. But since the arrest, she had been pestered by phone calls and people coming by, and that forced her to move. On October the 2nd in 1920, a woman's body was discovered and it was charred beyond recognition. It took about 2 years for the remains to be identified, but once they were, police tracked down Eugenia. She was then arrested on suspicion of murder. She admitted to disposing of Annie's body and choosing to burn it so that it couldn't be identified. She was worried that if Annie's body was identified, that she would be arrested and labeled a deviant because her secret would be exposed. But that's actually what happened. A lot of people to this very day believe that Eugenia did kill Annie, but the autopsy does state otherwise. Several fractures were found in the skull, mainly due to the heat of the fire, but the coroner couldn't tell whether Annie was dead before the fire started in the first autopsy. He reported that there weren't any definite marks of violence and concluded that Annie had probably died due to the burns. The initial inquest returned an open verdict on Halloween of 1917, and Annie's remains were buried in a coffin marked the body of an unknown woman at Rookwood Cemetery. An open verdict is a verdict of a coroner's jury, admitting that a suspicious death has occurred but not specifying what actually caused it. After a visit with his aunt, young Harry met with police because he never believed that his mother would leave him and not bother to contact him or his aunt, so he placed a missing person notice in the Police Gazette 3 years after she disappeared. He also told police that after returning from a trip and finding his mother missing, Eugenia had taken him to a known suicide spot called The Gap, where she threw stones off the cliff and had even tried to lure him over the fence to the edge of the cliff. She had also taken him to a scrubland area and asked him to dig a hole. He did, but Eugenia became emotional and she threw the shovel into the bushes and they returned home. Another thing that made him suspicious of Eugenia was that as he was reading an article about the shoes of an unknown burn victim being found, young Harry was also able to identify the personal effects as his mother's, particularly her shoes which Eugenia had repaired. She was arrested on July 5th, 1920, and at the time of the arrest, she asked to be placed in the women's cells and requested that her wife not be told about her true identity. Amongst the male clothing that was found in a locked leather suitcase, police also found what they described as a quote-unquote article. The article was made out of a chair leg and bound with rubber and cloth in the shape of a dildo. The interview between Eugenia and the police detective regarding that particular article find was repeated in court. Eugenia said, "You will find it, something there that I've been using." The detective says, "What is it, something artificial?" Eugenia says, "Yes, but don't let her see it." The detective says, "Do you mean to say that she doesn't know anything about this?" Eugenia said that her first wife didn't know about it either, not until the latter part of their marriage. After Eugenia was arrested, Annie's body was exhumed and re-examined, and a large linear crack to the back of the skull was discovered under X-ray, so nothing new was found, and Annie's body was then released to her family for burial. A large crowd was in attendance when Eugenia was brought to court. The murder was sensational enough in the 1900s, but it took a back seat to what was referred to as the gender-bending aspects of the case. She was labeled as a sexual hermaphrodite, a homosexualist, a masquerader, a person with misplaced atoms, a sex pervert, a passing woman, a transgendered man, and as gender dysphoric. And this is how a newspaper described Eugenia. The accused woman is strangely interesting. She bore an extraordinary resemblance to a man, for facially she is masculine. She wore a man's clothes, her face is considerably wrinkled, and suggests that she is older than her stated 43 years of age. Her clothing consisted of a well-worn dark gray cloth sack suit, a white tennis shirt, and a neatly tied green Broadway tie. Her well-polished boots were of patent leather. Sydney's man-woman created a sensation, and at the preliminary hearing in July of 1920, Eugenia appeared in men's clothing. At the trial for murder in October, however, she was dressed as a woman. It was argued that Eugenia had perpetrated sex fraud and had killed to cover her deception. The defense countered that she was innocent and merely a congenital invert. The prosecutor said the accused was so practical in deceit as to be able to convince two women for years that she was a man. There were several witnesses testifying to the rocky relationship and the distraught behavior of Eugenia in the weeks after the murder and how she was frequently found drinking alone. The evidence of a woman named Henrietta was very damning. She had rented a room to Harry, aka Eugenia, and he told her that he and Annie had had an argument and that he gave her a crack on the head and he left. Eugenia's daughter gave this statement at the trial. I first remember my mother when I was about 7 years of age. She always wore men's clothing and was known as Harry Crawford. My mother was very cruel to me when I was a child and often forgot me. Mrs. DeAngelis, who brought me up, died when I was about 14, and my mother then called for me and took me to a little confectionery shop kept by a Mrs. Burkitt who had a son named Harry. My mother told me Mrs. Burkitt had some money and always thought that my mother was a man. I said to my mother, she'll find you out one of these days, but mother replied, oh, I'll watch it. I would rather do away with myself than let police find out anything about me. My mother told me to always call her father and not let Mrs. Burkitt or anyone else know that she was a woman. I didn't know that my mother was married to Mrs. Burkitt, but they occupied the same bedroom. Eugenia was convicted and sentenced to death, but her sentence was commuted. She was released from Long Bay Prison in February of 1931 due to bad health, and she assumed the name of Jean Ford and worked as a landlady in Sydney, Australia. She continued to deny that she had anything to do with Annie's death. She said that she was found guilty on false evidence. While in prison, she was asked what her motive was, but all she said was that she had to do it because there was nothing else. On June 9th, 1938, Eugenia stepped off the pavement in front of a car and she died the following day in a hospital in Sydney.